Hello and welcome. My name is Matthew Marquit, and in this particular video I want to show you guys a little bit about Algorithmic's Bitmap2Material. Now, with an Algorithmic's suite of programs, you have Substance Painter, Substance Designer, and of course this program. And this program has kind of a smaller role than the other two. It's a little bit more of a simple program. This one actually converts images into complex materials or textures, right? So that you can create complex materials within your engine. What this does is it actually saves you time. Old school way of doing things, you always had a high poly model everything and bake it all out of your 3D program of choice. So you would bake out your normal maps, you would bake out your ambient occlusion and so on. Now you can actually use images with programs like this that will convert those images into these complex textures that you can apply then into these materials into a video game engine. So this actually saves some time. Now that's not 100% perfect. You're not always going to get the exact results that you want, but trust me, if you've seen the power of this program already, you know that it does do a pretty good job fairly quickly. So the first thing, of course, if you want to get the program, you go to Algorithmic's site, right, algorithmic.com. There's a section here that says download and buy. You can click on that, and then this will allow you to see their different programs, including Substance, Bitmap2Material here. So you can click on the download for Windows or Mac and try it, right? Once again, just as I've shown in other videos, if you go to educational license, if you need the educational license of it, right, log in, show them student ID, and you get a free 1-year renewable license for this program. Okay, just like the other two, Designer and Painter, just the same. So once you've installed the program, like I said, really simple program to work with. This is what it looks like when you first open it up, and it basically begs you to do what it's asking here, which is drop a bitmap and then you can go. So right, like I said, it's all based off of the image. But we're going to talk about the interface real quick before we do that. First thing, of course, we do have our drop down menus, right? And so if you need to have certain menus, you don't care for the 2D view, you can shut the 2D view off and on, so on and so forth. And just as you can tell clearly now, this is the 2D view section, and we can change and move these around, kind of get a better visual. This is our 3D view section, and then this is our parameters section. So there's really not much to the entirety of this program, okay? So the cool thing about the 2D is it actually breaks down every one of the types of images that you'll be creating by default, or if you've added new ones, you can actually just see them up here. This one, of course, has a lot of different options in 3D, and this right here is basically your options of changing the texture that you've brought in. All right, so let's look at the things that we've got by actually adding in said texture. So I have, and like I said, you can add any image in, but I've got this image here that I found on the internet, brick pavement. We're going to drop this right in here, and you can see I've actually exported out some maps for some of these already. But what happens is the moment you drag it in, it basically asks you to load in a different channel. So which do you want? Do you want to do the normal map, the metallic, the height, so on and so forth? Obviously, if you're going to base it off of an image from the beginning, we're usually going to choose our main input, like just a normal photograph. But if you happen to have, a normal map or metallic and those other things, you can drop those in and have that use that instead of create its own. So anyways, we'll just do main input. And now you'll quickly see down here, right, in our 3D scene that we do have this object in here, and it's already fairly complex looking, right? We can see a little bit of a shine to it, a little bit of dimension, and yes, by the way, I've actually downloaded this using Steam, as you can see over here, so it kind of pops up with that over there in the corner. Either way, right, as we can see here, now that we have our image in, now we can start tweaking some of these things. In our 2D view, right, we'll see our base color, the original image that we brought in. We can look at a roughness, a metallic, a normal map, the height map, ambient occlusion, and so forth. We can also zoom in, so this allows you to kind of zoom in, so you can choose like, that's 100%, so it stays the same, but you can do 200% and so on, right, or even go smaller. Okay, actually on this side over here, you can also change the size of it if you actually change the output size that you want in the first place. Now, because this image itself is only 512, it is defaulting over here by 512, but you can increase or decrease the size. I mean, clearly if you increase the size, say we go to 2048, you see it gets much bigger over here because now that's the 1-to-1 size. But if we look over at this base, I mean, it's going to start getting pixelated. So you do want to be careful. Don't bring in smaller images and upscale them. Try to have images that are around the same size so that all of the quality of the images are the same. All right, so I can maybe get away with double sizing. You see here with 1024, but it does still look a little beat up or pixelated. So always, like I said, clearly be mindful of that as you're working with your image or importing your image in. Okay, so let's talk about quickly what we can do to kind of see the the texture, and then we'll get into the settings and parameters. Okay, so what do we have with our drop downs here? Well, the first one is your geometry drop down, and this one basically lets you choose different types of geometry. First one, and I have actually set to rounded cube right here. I believe the default is just cube, but you can also set to cylinder. Right, we can take a look at it in a more cylindrical shape, and then they have things like inner box, which is kind of cool. It's a box within a box, and so on. Okay, now if you want, you can even load up your own mesh, right, and then use that to have the texture tile over. So you're more than welcome to load up a mesh that you've already got. So I'm just going to set it right back to the rounded cube. All right, now in the materials section, we can actually choose what types of materials, workflows that we're going to use, whether it be Blinn, Lambert, and then mesh info is actually cool because it can show you, things like, normal map, tangent space, UV, vertex coloring. But right now you can see it's set to the physically based renderings metallic roughness option, right, at tessellation. And so that's the default. That should be fine for most programs. But if you're using a specular glossiness route, you can change it to that also. And if you actually happen to have other types of shaders you want to load them, you're more than welcome to do that too. Okay. You can even see that it can break down the channels, and then you can say which channels do I want. I definitely do not ever want, on this one, an emissive. I don't want anything glowing, so I can shut that channel off. And then if I went back to materials, you'd actually see that channel is shut off, and it won't export and so on, right? So those are and what it does too is it's what it shows in the viewport, right? So now the emissive won't be showing in the viewport. Okay. Lights, self-explanatory, right? We click over here and hit edit, and it will change the lighting in the scene. Now, there's a couple of different ways to manipulate the lights. You can change the colors of the lights. You can turn them on and off. So you can see there's a light over here on the side. We can turn them on and off. Right? We can play around with that. I don't play too much with this. Usually I just leave it default, but you're more than welcome to do that because there's a couple of lights, like I said, in the scene. You can change the colors and so on. But really what you want to do in order to manipulate the lights, and I can, whoops, I didn't want to shut that off. Let's try this again and go to 3D view. But if you really want to manipulate the lights, you can hold down Shift and then use the left mouse button to kind of move the light around, like rotate the light around. And you can use the right mouse button to kind of move the light in and out. Now you can tell right here, it's like you're just kind of guessing where it is. If you actually go over to display and we set it to light, whoops, I keep clicking off of that. We set it to light, you'll now see the light line itself. So now I can have a little bit better control as I'm moving my mouse up and down, left and right, and so on, so that we can get a better view of where this light is coming from, right? So we'll just zoom it in on that so we can get a better look. That's pretty much the only one, by the way, when we go to display that I find useful. Wireframe, I don't know why you'd really want to use that, but you can also add a grid to the bottom, an axis, point, or a bounding box on said model. So you can do those if you want, but I tend to not like them. You can see what they look like in your own time if you want to check those out. Right, so that's lights. And then with camera, we have over here what we can do is it shows you focus is and it's the F key, by the way. If you happen to move the object like off in space or whatever, you just hit F and it should center the object. Pretty simple concept, right? But it also allows you to go through different views. So if I want to do a back view of my object, right? Or if I want to do a front view, I can just do that and it automatically rotates it around for me. We can zoom up on it, take a look at it, and we can even move the light in this viewport, right? So you can get a better view of just like how awesome that is. Remember, I just brought in a photograph, a normal photograph, but it's adding all this dimension and specularity and all this other stuff, just because, that's, like I said, the point of the program. So it is pretty cool when you see it in action. Right, so it has all those different views that you can go to. The environment is just, the background pretty much, right? So we can just rotate and be back in perspective view here. But the background, you can turn it off. And to be honest with you, I tend to like to turn it off so it doesn't get distracting. You can increase or decrease the exposure if you want, right? And you can see it actually affects the geometry even if the scene is shut off, right? So we'll just set that back to, and you can just type a number in here. So I'll just go in here and go to 0 again, and we can shut off the visibility of this. You can even rotate, of course, the scene if you want. And that's a different way to get the ambient lighting of the scene to rotate with you, right? So remember, this is a point light. This is a separate light, but there is the ambient light of the scene that rotates, and you can see how it changes and the effect on the geometry also, right? So we'll just shut that off. All right, now the scene, this one, you can just reset the scene completely if you want. The edit, if you just hit edit, it really doesn't do anything other than hide the object on and off. and then display I kind of already talked about. So those are basically the things that you need to know as far as these drop downs go. And now, of course, the bread and butter of the parameters and how we change things is over here on the side. So we already talked about the output size and how that stuff works. There's also a section here. We'll go down. Now, all of these are relevant always, but let's just kind of quickly talk about some of them. So global here. You can change the method of the way that it works. You can have it, I tend to just leave it on the luminance based. To be honest with you, I'm not really even sure what a lot of this stuff means, so I just leave those defaults. But we can play around with some things like, you can start moving sliders, and to be honest with you, a lot of times, and you'll see right here, I move the slider. Sometimes you have to give it a second before it thinks, or you have to do like a crazy number before it does anything, right? But notice I'm moving this light equalizer, and suddenly it looks like trash. I'll have to be honest with you, as far as this program works, it's basically how you use it. You move sliders around, you change things. Does it look good? Does it look bad? If it looks bad, obviously change it. Does it look good? Obviously keep it. So that's kind of the way that you want to work it. Anyways, you can also make textures tile in here. So this is actually really cool. You can turn this on, and there's different ways that it can tile. And the moment you turn it on, you actually get a couple of other, basically a couple of other options. Now, as you can see here, clearly be mindful that different types of tiling works for different types of textures. If we have clear and obvious lines like this one does, it's going to look a little silly. Now, to be fair, this texture already tiles, and it uses the grout line to tile. But if you happen to have kind of more of an organic texture, right, where you can't really tell, this one will work great. But you can see you can even change the different drop downs, and some of them will work better than others. You can see this one actually works even for this, right? So it's just dependent on that. And then you can change, like, where it's and how the fade of the tiling is. So you can move this slider around and see that, and it will actually change how the tiling is fading or changing, right? So it's up to you, but this is kind of cool. And then you can just completely invert the relief of the object. Though I tend to find that usually it knows what it's doing, and if you just leave it off, it's fine, right? So that's if you choose to make it tile. Otherwise, just leave it off. If it already tiles, that's great, okay? Or if it's, like I said, a texture sheet, then it really doesn't need a tile, so we wouldn't touch any of that at all. Now, the relief section, this is basically controls the normal and the height of the object, or the height map of the object. So you can see right here that we have different frequencies you can play with. There's a low, mid, and high. If you change them, they affect different things. So the low frequencies, if we could see here, it's and once again, you have to kind of sometimes give it a second to catch up. But you can see the low frequencies are all those tiny little details, right? So if I go, and this is, and keep in mind, at the center here, this is considered 0, right? So there's going to be no extra height or depth in this case if we leave it at 0. But if we wanted to make it look like it goes down a little bit, we go more towards the negative. If we want it to look like it's going up a little bit, we go more towards the positive. But this is how it works as far as your low, your mids, and your highs. And each one will do something different because they're different levels of detail. And as I said before, once again, you move sliders around and you get what you want, right? So I'm just going to leave all those default because it looks fine like that. Now, the overall intensity of the entire thing can also be changed, right? And so you see right here, it's set to like 16 by default, which is right in the middle. If you go all the way down to 0, it should look flat. Like you won't get any real 3D dimension. Just whatever you're going to get in your diffuse is what you're getting. This increases it. Of course, if you go too much, it might look a little silly, but it's up to you. Right, on this one, if we go all the way up, it does start making these tiles look a little rounded on the edge. If that's what you want, fine. If not, we do have to be careful and just always be mindful of that. Now, of course, you can always zoom close in too, right? This really helps when we're moving sliders around to really see kind of what we're doing here, right? So as we move the slider around, how much it's actually affecting the overall scene. Okay, your normal format, this is all dependent on what your game engine uses. So there's their DirectX and OpenGL, so you can set that if you know which one it is. Okay, relief input, right? You can actually change this if you happen to actually have a height input or a normal map input. You can use that. So it's basically saying, hey, do you have a height input, or and use that. Otherwise, we just hit off, and then it just calculates its own height and normal map up here, right? So that's up to you if you want to change that. And then there's a little pinch level that you can play around with. But once again, be careful, because some of these settings, when you play around with them, they just look like trash. This one, of course, if we play with the radius, we might get it to look somewhat decent, right, from the default. But, it's up to you, like I said, to play around with it and see if anything changes. Okay, now the diffuse section, this lets you change some things that you could easily change in Photoshop, like your luminosity, hue, shift, contrast, and saturation. However, if you happen to want to make some tweaks and not have to jump into Photoshop before you brought this in here, go ahead. The ones that are more useful, I find, is something like the light cancellation. This one actually works great when you're trying to tile it. Sometimes when you have too much shadows or too many like dark spots on it, you can kind of average them out by moving around the light cancellation. This is also useful, and if you go all the way to the side here, it starts graying some things out. But some of these tools, and then, whoops, so you're saying like light cancellation, it's like assuming there's a light coming in from a certain direction. You can see right here, the moment I start moving the slider, suddenly I get this light cancellation angle, assuming that the light is coming from up. If I go down, then I'll be canceling light that's more like, say, coming down and so on. It just uses these calculations in the images, right? But it doesn't always work perfectly, but if you're trying to get rid of some of these details, you go ahead and do that, especially if you're trying to create an albedo as opposed to what is typically known as a diffuse texture. With a diffuse, we'll have like shadows and other things painted in it, while albedo is just colors. So you can play around with the stuff. You also can cancel out, and with it in combination with your light cancellation, you can also use your AO cancellation or ambient occlusion cancellation, and you can play around with the radius of the ambient occlusion, so you can give different effects, right? So you can move that slider around, see what that does. Diffuse detail, I'm not really sure what that does. Doesn't look like I'm not seeing much of anything happening. Sometimes you'll move a slider, nothing happens because it's depending on some other setting or something that you don't necessarily have turned on. Just be mindful of that. Now, roughness and gloss. So remember, you have the two different workflows. You have the glossiness, right? You have your specular and gloss, and then you have your metallic and roughness. And so here we can play around with those values. See right here, it's got a roughness value. The default is set to 0.5. We can either set the roughness to 0, right? Well, in this case, actually, if we set it to 0, it becomes very mirror-like. It's kind of hard to tell. But the scene is, and the object is a lot more mirror-like, so we're getting these kind of weird speckles. If you actually set all the way to 1, it's going to be super duper rough, and we're not going to get any kind of reflections or any light bouncing off of it at all. So it does make sense to have a little bit, but you want to be careful of how much you put on it, right? So it doesn't look like it's covered with Reynolds wrap or it's made out of plastic. But you will get a little bit of it. Usually in the middle is a good decent one, or close to the middle, as you can see, which the default was already. But once again, fool around with those, get whatever you want. Same thing could be said with these other ones. I'm not going to fool around with those. You can do those kind of things in your own time and see how they change your roughness map. Now there's the metallic one. The metallic one can also be chosen from, you can either from the main input, or if you actually happen to have a metallic input already, you can use that. Okay. There's different other settings. Like I said, most of these I don't really understand all the science behind them, things like that. So I don't play around with too much stuff. But you can play around with the metallic value itself, which is down here. So just like roughness, it has a 0 to 1 range. So does your metallic, as a 0 to 1 range. And you can see right here where it says the metal minimum value starts at 0, but you can set it all the way up to 1. And if you go all the way to 1, which is more, in this case, more metallic, you can see how it changes it from, in this case, stone, which is more or less what it really is supposed to look like, to what would look like kind of like these metal blocks almost, which is a little silly. And then if you were to say go into the roughness and set that down, well, now it really looks metal. So I mean, heck, if you wanted to make these look metal-like, I guess you can do that, right? It can even like defy what the original texture looks like. But of course that does look a little silly. But this is almost, the theory behind this is, with the roughness being 0, at least in Bitmap2Material, keep in mind different programs have 0 and 1 mean something different for each, but 0 in roughness in Bitmap2Material and 1 in the metal value will create kind of basically chrome. So that's kind of what we're seeing here, is like this reflection. Now the surface itself, because the normal map is so bumpy, we don't get to see the perfect reflection, but that does exist. So I'd go back and obviously just leave this to where it was in the other settings, and it looks more realistic that way, right? So this is clearly not metal, so we'll leave it all the way down. Okay, ambient occlusion. Right, so we can play around with those. Same thing, it has a low, mid, and high frequencies. So it looks at the shadows that are more in the low frequencies, the small detail shadows, as we can see here, the medium detail shadows, which we're not seeing much of a change as I move the slider around, and then the high ones, same thing. We're just getting just barely a difference as we move the slider around. You can change the AO levels here. You can change the sharpen of the ambient occlusion, and so on. So once again, not playing with all these numbers, you can do that in your own time, right? Grunge maps. So you can add a grunge map by default set off, but you can hit on, or if you actually have a grunge map, like you actually have an image you want to overlay with it, so it kind of blends it in the background. It's kind of cool. Or you can use their default ones. They happen to have 10 default ones. So if you hit on, you can see right here, and I got to scroll this down, thinking a little bit here. So if you turn it on, and this one I just scrolled from input by mistake, but we'll set it back to on, and on will let you choose different options. So right here we have 1 through 10. I wish they would like give you an actual name of what kind of grunge map it might be, like leak or crack or something. Anyways, you just have to click on them and see. But you can see right here when I hit 5, suddenly we get these lines that are kind of coming down. Very faint, but they're there. And that's the point of the grunge maps, is just to kind of beat it up a little bit, but not go too crazy. But you can play with these settings to change that, right? So with the contrast and so on, we can move it in. If you increase the contrast, now you start seeing those lines a little bit more clearly on the surface. And so if I was to change it to a different grunge map, you'll see this. This one's kind of more of like a cloudy type grunge map, as you can see, and so on. So it's kind of up to you. You can invert the grunge map, so the parts that are dark are now white, and the parts that are white are now dark, so on, right? And you can see that as I click it, you'll see the changes, right? It's more of like a clouds, I guess, effect, right, as I mentioned before. Okay, and all these different sliders will do different things. Like I said, I'm not always 100% sure what they do until I move them, but the same thing could be said about that. Yeah, that clearly doesn't look good if we increase that, unless you want it to look like somebody spilled paint all over the place. I mean, I guess then that would be great. Yeah, whatever. So it's up to you how you want to use these and play around with these different settings and see what they do, right? So go ahead, do whatever you want, but once again, you can just have it off. You don't need to have a grunge map on, but it's just there to kind of spice it up a little bit. Your advanced section, this one just basically allows you to move your texture around, right? So let's just say like maybe there is lines in your texture, but they're like right here, and you want to see what they look when they're basically lined up with the top. This just takes the texture and lines it up in the box perfectly. But like I said, maybe your texture itself has a line here, and you just want to kind of line it up at the top and see what that looks like when it's on the edge of something. That's kind of what you do here. So your input scale and your input position. So scale, this could be changed independent. Which could be it seems silly, but yes, you can see what it looks like when it's mushed. But I mean, you can type numbers in. So if I want to like increase the amount of this, all the way up to, in this case it shows 200, right? So we're doubling it up. Whoops, I put in 20, so that's even less, right? But if we just type in 200 and hit enter, and on this one I can come and just hit 200 and enter. Now it's basically double tiled, right? So we can see that when it's double tiled. But like I said, you can also have it so that it is just even smaller, right? And so that's up to you how you move the slider around. So you can move these, you can move these, and that way you don't actually have to type a number in, but the value only goes up to 200, right? So you can't go any higher than that. The X and the Y is just moving on those axes, right? So we see if we move it on X, you can do that. You can slide it left and right. It takes a second sometimes for the texture to catch up, and then up and down with the Y, okay? Lastly is your outputs, and outputs are easy, right? I mean, so I showed you before, I was talking about here with the materials, and you can turn on the different channels. This just shows them in the viewport, but over here is what you're actually going to export at all. So you can have, like, say, your base color, your roughness, your metallic, your normal, your height, your ambient occlusion, all of those things, right? Those are the defaults. If those are on, you can turn on other ones, like I can turn on, in this case, diffuse. I can turn on, specular, glossiness, whatever, add those values, have those things show up here, and then manipulate them, and so on. All right, but that's basic. Whoops, I'm starting to move some sliders around here by mistake. Oh, metallic blending mode, that's what's going on. So apparently I was hovering over that and started going crazy. So I'm not really sure exactly what I did, but irrelevant. Actually, that doesn't look too bad, even though that's not what I was going for originally, right? But let's just say, okay, now we're done. So I just be careful, clearly, because as I was rolling my mouse wheel, if I was hovering over these when I rolled my mouse wheel, I actually changed the settings. So that's something I learned. Don't do that. Anyways, so with our object here, now that we have our texture done, pretty simple concept. You just export it, right? So you can see up here that it says export, hotkeys F10, export a bitmap. Right, and you come up here, so you choose the folder, right? So we can click on here and browse, and so I can go to, like, say, we're at my desktop and I've got a folder ready, Bitmap2Material. We'll use that one. Okay, you can choose the file format you want to save it as, right? So I'm using Targa or TGA. Those tend to be one of my favorite ones. You can change the compression over here. This sets it to 100% by default. Right here's the base name pattern, so it kind of shows you, it's basically a naming convention is really what it is. You can just use the default, but it shows you right here that this is the output name, the graph name, right, the package name. So if you want to have it say, you know, like start off with output name and then by graph name and so on, then you just do percent, you know, p, percent, you know, whatever, right? So this just shows you what each one of those things means, right? So you can stick that up there and get your naming convention. And then anything with, I don't know much about metadata, so I'm not going to talk about those because I don't really know what that does. But anyways, the select output export here is another one where you're like, okay, which maps do I want? Okay, I don't want opacity or emissive or detail normal or curvature or bump or displacement, right, and so on. So you can have those as different things. And once you have everything that you want, and this is even more than I want, but whatever, we'll just leave it. And then you just hit export, and that's it. I mean, that's as simple as it is. So now if I was to say go to that folder, right, so let me go, I'll just click on wall demo here, go to my desktop and Bitmap2Material, and there you go. So there's all the images that exported out, and basically everything we're seeing up here, right? So each one of those. So then you go to your set engine of choice and then just plug those things in. So that pretty much is it. I mean, like I said, simple program. Obviously there's a little bit more to it than I explained, but the basics of all you really need to know is right here in this video. So hopefully this video helped you guys understand Bitmap2Material a little bit better, and I will see you guys in the next one.